Again, just like the last presentation, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A and they will address those afterward. Also, the presentation is now up online and I'll post a link to it in the chat so that you can follow along. First, we're going to introduce Michelle Dressner. She is an economist for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and serves as the project coordinator for the Occupational Requirements Survey. Prior to working with the ORS, Michelle worked in occupational safety and health statistics, producing statistics on non-fatal occupational injuries. Next is Karen. Karen's career with the BLS includes 20 years of collecting and analyzing compensation benefit and job requirements data. Her current role is the National Training Coordinator, writing and delivering technical training for BLS professional economists and statisticians. She is also a program expert for the ORS. We welcome both of them and appreciate them for presenting. I'll pass it to you, ladies.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. We're so happy to teach you about the Occupational Requirements Survey, or the ORS. The ORS is a product of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it provides job-related information on physical demands, environmental conditions, education, training, and experience, as well as cognitive and mental requirements for jobs in the U.S. economy. The Social Security Administration is a stakeholder in the ORS and plans to use the ORS in the future for disability insurance adjudication. In addition to the SSA, the ORS can be used by other federal agencies, job seekers, human resources professionals, and vocational experts. So our goals for today are to introduce you to our published data, which we call estimates, to help you understand what the estimates mean, and finally, to help you find the information that you're looking for on our website. So first, let's talk about the sample. The ORS uses the quarterly census of employment and wages as a sampling frame. The QCEW is derived from state unemployment insurance rolls, and it represents 97% of all workers in the US. The ORS includes civilian workers, which are workers in private industry, state government, and local government. Major exclusions from the ORS are federal workers and military personnel, agricultural workers, volunteers, the self-employed, and business owners. The ORS publishes estimates by occupation and uses the standard occupational classification system to classify 6-digit occupations. Using the SOC allows ORS estimates to be comparable to other data that uses the SOC system, such as the Occupational Employment Statistics Survey, which publishes pay rates by area and occupation. The Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illnesses also uses the SOC. The SOC is updated every 8 years to include new jobs that have emerged in the economy and phase out those that no longer exist. The 2019 ORS estimates use the 2018 SOC. Another really important concept about the ORS is that the ORS defines scope of work as requirements in support of critical job functions and critical tasks, where a critical job function is defined as the main purpose of the job and the primary factor of pay. Critical tasks are activities workers must perform to carry out the critical job functions. The ORS estimates reflect requirements of work without accommodations. An accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job or a change in the work environment that enables a person with a disability to compete equally or carry out occupational tasks as generally performed. While some employers may be able to accommodate individuals with disabilities or limitations, the ORS estimates reflect requirements for all workers in the selected job without accommodations. So what do we mean by estimates? Because the ORS is a survey, the collected data are reviewed to ensure collection procedures were followed, calculated and weighted to represent a target population, and also to account for survey non-response. Non-response may occur for a variety of reasons, including that respondents might be unwilling or unable to provide us data. After sampling adjustments and weighting, we refer to data as published estimates. To maximize the amount of publishable information, BLS combined data across 3 samples collected over a 3-year period to produce the reference year 2018 estimates, which are called the first wave. The first wave included these reference years and data from about 25,300 establishments. We were able to publish estimates for 22 occupational groups, so for example, healthcare support occupations, and 397 detailed occupations. So these are more specific types of jobs, like home healthcare aides, and those fall within the occupational groups. Collection began for the second wave in August of 2019, and it will include 50,000 establishments collected over a period of 5 years. These estimates will be published at the conclusion of each reference year, but they're considered preliminary until the entire 5 years of data are included, which is expected to be in 2023. So initially, in the first wave estimates, jobs within establishments were selected using a random probability method. Using that method, there were lots of data on occupations with large number of employees. So we were getting large numbers of teachers and nurses, and not so much data on jobs with lower employment like radiation therapists and archivists. So we changed the sampling methodology this wave to better capture those less common occupations. So in order to do that, we used data from another BLS survey to learn more about the types of establishments that might contain certain occupations with low employment. The OR staff then developed an approach to predetermine jobs and prioritize jobs with low employment in the national economy during collection. This allows the flexibility over time to reallocate portions of the sample with the ultimate goal of publishing more jobs and more requirements within those jobs. The second wave also reintroduced cognitive and mental requirements. They were published initially during the first wave, and then reworked to better meet the needs of data users and stakeholders. The 2019 estimates included data from approximately 10,000 establishments, and there were 21,359 total estimates published. This includes estimates for 21 occupational groups and 205 detailed occupations. Remember, though, that 2019 estimates are considered preliminary because they only include one sample group. As additional sample groups are combined in future years, the number of occupations and the number of requirements will increase. Some ORS estimates include a duration when the requirement is present. Durations are seldom, occasionally, frequently, and constantly. The durations are estimated as a % of the workday, which is really helpful since not everyone works an 8-hour workday. So you can use ORS estimates even if you're talking about a part-time job that works 4 hours per day or a production job that works 12 hours per day. If you see an estimate that says climbing is required seldom for a particular job, the estimate reflects that the task is required for less than 2% of the workday. Occasionally is 2% up to 1/3 of the workday. Frequently is 1/3 to 2/3 of the workday, and constantly is more than 2/3 of the workday. Some ORS estimates also measure frequency, which is how often something happens and not the total time spent. For instance, 97.3% of cashiers are required to problem solve less often than monthly, including never. So that's an example of a frequency in the ORS. So we've been talking about a lot of top-line numbers, telling you how many estimates we've published. But what does that really mean? So we've got some different types of estimates. We publish % of workers means or averages, and percentile data. Let's go over some examples together. Here are some examples of the percentage of worker estimates. So the chart on the left shows that 93.4% of all workers are required to speak as part of their job, and 6.6% are not. On the right is an example of a detailed occupation, which is police and sheriff's patrol officers. So among police and sheriff's patrol officers, 100% are required to speak. About 51% speak frequently and 49% speak occasionally. Sometimes we publish estimates that include means. These means can be hours, days, or like you're seeing in this chart, pounds. So what you see here is the mean maximum weight lifted or carried for different occupational groups. On the far left is the average for all workers, and that's about 27 pounds. And then you see specific groups through the chart. So the mean weight lifted or carried for office and administrative support occupations, which are mostly clerical jobs, is 9.2 pounds. And construction and extraction occupations lift an average of 52.4 pounds. So taking a step further, we also publish distributions of percentiles and estimates when that's possible. So here you can see the 10th percentile, 25th percentile, 50th percentile, which is the median, 75th percentile, and the 90th. So this chart shows the mean, the mean weight lifted or carried, or this is actually the percentiles. So going back to the mean weight lifted or carried, we can see the mean across the different occupations and occupational groups. And then this group shows examples of percentiles. So we divided instead by 10th percentile, 25th percentile, 50th, 70th, and 90th. So now that we've talked about the types of estimates, so we have the percentages and the means and the percentiles, we'll actually review some examples of requirements estimates. So just a quick review, we have 4 categories of these requirements. So we have physical demands, education, training, and experience, environmental conditions, and cognitive and mental requirements. So we're going to start today by talking about physical demands. And these physical demands estimates include standing and walking, climbing, and driving. So it would take a while to talk about all of them, but we'll pull a select few and highlight them for you. So the first we have highlighted is gross and fine manipulation. So gross manipulation is working with the hands. So examples of gross manipulation are holding a steering wheel while driving, picking up a phone, and carrying a box. An example from 2019 estimates is electricians. So 100% of electricians are required to use gross manipulation on the job, and 58.6% require frequent use of hands, which from the duration chart, if you remember, is 1/3 to 2/3 of the day. Fine manipulation is working or grasping with the fingers. And examples of fine manipulation are handling cash, filing, and pushing buttons on a machine. So a really good example for this one is EMTs. So if you look closely at the picture, the EMT seems to be taking the patient's pulse, which is an example of fine manipulation on this job. 100% of EMTs are required to use fine manipulation, and taking a step further, it is required occasionally, which is 2% to 1/3 of the time for this occupation. So next we'll look at reaching. So there are 2 types of reaching that are measured by the oars. So we measure reaching overhead and reaching at or below the shoulder. So while some occupations have a high percentage of one or the other, some occupations require both types of reaching. So you might be reaching overhead and you might also be reaching at or below the shoulder. So the first chart on the left is overhead reaching, and it is required for 100% of carpenters and not required for 100% of travel clerks. The second chart, which is on the right-hand side, shows reaching at or below the shoulder. And you can see that it is required for 100% of bartenders and not required for 74.9% of computer systems analysts. So next, we'll talk about pushing or pulling. So the ORS distinguishes in pushing or pulling between the use of the upper or lower limbs, even though it's not on this chart. And then we also publish whether one or both limbs is required. So pushing or pulling has a very specific definition in the ORS. And to meet the criteria as measured by the ORS for pushing and pulling, workers either push any amount of work that require with 10 pounds of force or more, or push with any amount of force for 2/3 or more of the workday. So some examples of pushing or pulling with force would be pushing an adult in a wheelchair or pushing a snowblower to clear some sidewalks. So what you see on this chart here is 22.8% of all workers are required to push or pull with hands or arms, and 21.9% are required to push or pull with feet or legs. The remainder of workers are not required to push or pull. So the ORS also measures strength levels. So there are 5 main strength levels measured by the ORS, and you can see that in this chart. We start with sedentary on the left, and then clockwise light strength level, medium strength level, heavy, and then very heavy. So 27% of jobs are considered sedentary. And a few examples of jobs where sedentary strength is required for 90% of workers or more are bill and account collectors, software developers, and dispatchers. 33.8% of jobs are considered light work. And some examples of jobs where a light strength level is required for 90% of workers or more are elementary and middle school teachers and hosts and hostesses. And about 28.5% of jobs require medium strength. And then a few jobs that are examples of medium strength and where it's common are animal caretakers and automotive mechanics. Here are some additional strength estimates by occupational group. So occupational groups are shown on the vertical axis here, and then the percentage is shown along the bottom of the chart. So the dark blue bars show sedentary work, medium blue shows light work, and light blue shows medium work. So at the top, you see that over 80% of business and financial workers, So at the bottom, you see business and financial workers, and they mostly require sedentary strength, as you can see in the chart. And then back at the top, you see production workers, and 80% of production workers require medium or light strength. So the ORS also publishes estimates on the number of hours in a day sitting versus standing. So any time not spent sitting or lying down is included in standing. So that means that walking is included in standing. So for sitting and standing here, the total amount of time sitting or standing sums to the full daily work schedule. So on your screen, you see an example of human resources specialists. And HR specialists spend an average of 85.7% of the day sitting and 14.3% of the day standing. And then the total workday, 85.7 plus 14.3 is 100%. So here are some more sitting and standing estimates. And this chart shows the percentage of the workday sitting or standing by occupation. And at the top, you can see that cashiers were required to stand for about 96% of their workday and sit for 4%. Maids and housekeeping cleaners and carpenters also stood for the majority of their workday. In contrast, other occupations spend the majority of the workday sitting. For example, software developers sat for 93.1% of the workday, and school bus drivers also sit for the majority of their workday. And the final physical demand we're going to talk about now is low postures. So let's imagine a library clerk. So there are bookshelves in the library that are close to the floor, and it's the clerk's job to shelve those books. There are several ways they can accomplish that task. They could bend at the waist to do it, which we call stooping, or they could crouch like a baseball croucher, or they could kneel, which means going on their knees on the ground. And the library doesn't care how they physically perform the task, just as long as they get it done. So when we publish data on low postures, we publish several things. So first, the duration of time low work is performed, again with durations, so seldom, occasionally, constantly, and frequently. And we also include estimates on whether workers have a choice or whether they're required to perform a specific low posture to get the work done. So in the library example, we would say the library clerk job requires stooping, crouching, and kneeling, and it is the worker's choice on how to get this done. So now that we've talked about the physical demands, I'm going to hand off this presentation to my colleague Karen, who will go through the rest of the ORS elements, as well as give you a great preview of the ORS resources and website.
Thanks, Mishi. Again, my name is Karen Litchke. I work for the BLS. And I would like to first, there was one question that I can answer really quick because I've been monitoring the chat. And the question was, are all these estimates available on the BLS website? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Everything that you're seeing today is available on the website. So the next group of elements we'd like to talk about are environmental conditions. And when we say environmental conditions, what we're talking about is the surrounding and the environment where people work. We publish estimates on exposure to wetness, extreme heat, extreme cold, and hazardous contaminants. We also publish estimates on the required use of PPE. But before you get excited about that, we don't collect exposure to diseases or biohazards. So the use of PPE that we're going to provide information on is PPE that's used to mitigate exposure to hazardous contaminants, to working in a high exposed place, to working around moving mechanical parts, or PPE that's used to mitigate noise exposure. So kind of diving into the specifics of some of the environmental conditions, the first one I'd like to talk about is outdoor exposure. So the way that we define outdoors is at least 3 walls and a roof. I'm sorry, the way we define indoors is at least 3 walls and a roof. So for example, if we have an automotive mechanic who's working at the garage, but the garage door is open, we would consider that worker to be working indoors because there's 3 walls and a roof. Anything that doesn't have that type of protection from the elements, we would consider to be outdoors. And in order for the estimates to reflect work as it is performed everywhere, we assume when we code for outdoor exposure that the workers are exposed to it being very hot, very cold, it being rainy, being windy, it being snowy. All of that is included in outdoor exposure. So when you look at our estimates and you see estimates for things like extreme heat, extreme cold, humidity, and wetness, that's not because of being outdoors. That is indoor exposure to those things. And examples of that would be working in a greenhouse, or working in a refrigerated or freezer type area, or working around something that's very hot like a boiler or hot ovens or something like that. So the next slide is going to show you a chart with examples of the percentage of workers exposed to the outdoors by occupation. And if you look at this chart, you can see up at the top that highway maintenance workers and construction laborers are exposed to outdoors 100% of the time, which makes sense because they work outside. If you look in the middle, bottom middle, you can see all workers, and about 33% of all workers do have some critical tasks that they perform outside. And then if you look down there at the bottom, you can see 17.3% of restaurant clerks work outside. You might be thinking, wait a minute, why would restaurant clerks work outside? I mean, restaurant cooks. Think about it, they could grill outside. That could be one of their critical tasks. Or it could be they have to take out the trash, or they have to take the grease outside to some designated area. So there are things that cooks do that could happen outside. The next element we're going to talk about is hazardous contaminants, and we've got a big, crazy-ish definition for this. So what we define this as substances that negatively affect the eye, skin, or respiratory system, or as they're inhaled, ingested, or come into contact with. So that's our definition of hazardous contaminants. What we do is we publish estimates on how these conditions are experienced by workers. So if someone's using personal protective equipment to eliminate their exposure, we would say that that exposure is fully mitigated. So for example, let's say it's an asbestos abatement worker. We would not say they're not exposed to hazardous contaminants. What we would say is the PPE that they use completely mitigates their exposure. Now, in some cases, it's not completely mitigated. In some cases, that a worker's using PPE, but there still is some risk of exposure. We also publish that. We publish the percent of workers that are using PPE that are exposed. So here's an example. Nuclear medical technologists, 15.9% of them are exposed to hazardous contaminants. And it's also interesting in our data that 15.9% of them use PPE. That doesn't completely mitigate the exposure. But in addition, we publish one more piece of information, which is 4.7% are both exposed and it's fully mitigated. So that's just kind of a little slice of the data and how you see that. And just a reminder on the hazardous contaminants, we do not collect information on blood or diseases. So if you're looking at a healthcare occupation, for example, and you don't see exposure to hazardous contaminants, that's why. All right, so that's our highlights of environmental conditions. The next thing we're going to talk about is training, education, and experience. And I think most of you are probably familiar with the term specific vocational preparation. BLS, we like to use acronyms, we call it SVP. And I'm happy to tell you that we publish the data on overall SVP, and we also publish estimates for each of the 4 components that you see on your screen. In order for SSA or HR professionals or vocational experts like you to determine whether someone has the necessary skills for a job, having an estimate of the education and the credentials and things that are required is useful. So the ORS estimates speak to the percent of workers required to have certain minimum requirements. So I have an example on this one too. So 100% of audiologists need to have a credential. And I happen to know that what that is it's a license. They have to have a license to be an audiologist. For that same position, audiologist, 82.3% of the time, no on-the-job training is required for our estimates. So when you're looking at the overall SVP for audiologists, you will know that the majority of it is going to be the credential, and then probably little to none of it would be the on-the-job training. So let's look at the percentage of some workers, the percentage of workers by minimum education level. So when we talk about minimum education level, what we're talking about is what's required for the job. A high school diploma is the most common requirement, and it's required for 40% of workers, like you see on your screen. The next most common is the one to the left of it, no minimum education, which is present 31% of the time. And then the other tall bar that you see kind of in the middle is a bachelor's degree. So we have kind of some areas where the data tend to cluster together. It's also important to note that the minimum education, when we collect it for ORS, we don't go with what the incumbent in the job has in terms of education. We go with what's required. So let's say, for example, we are talking about a job and the person that is in the job happens to have a PhD, but the job itself only requires a bachelor's degree. When we report that data for ORS, we would report that job as requiring a bachelor's degree. Something else that's interesting about our minimum education data is literacy. And when jobs have no formal education requirement, the estimates will show whether literacy is required or not. So we ask that. When you look at the formal education, the no formal education number, if you take the percent that are required to have literacy and add the percent not required, it will add up to no formal education. And you can see here on your screen, dishwashers, 59.8% do need to know how to read and write, 28.6% do not. So that's an example of of a literacy requirement data. The next thing we want to talk about is credentials, and credentials in the ORS include requirements for certifications, licenses, and educational certificates, which you see here on your screen. Our data aligns with the Gemena criteria. They're an interagency working group that develops standard measures and definitions of the categories that you see here on your screen. And if you're looking at the ORS estimates, you'll see all three of these have been published for certain jobs. And I just want to real quick run through what the difference is. So the first one, certification, it's issued by a certification body. So the American Association of whatever. And what it does is it acknowledges that specific skills have been acquired by the person who is occupying a job. Certifications do typically expire. They require usually some sort of continuing ed or something like that in order to keep their certification. Contrasting that with licenses, licenses are issued by a government agency or an organization working on behalf of a government agency, and they give you the legal right to perform a job. They also expire. A lot of times it's required for licenses to renew them or to get continuing ed, so that's licenses. And the final educational certificate category, what we're talking about here is certificates that are obtained either from a school or from a training provider that certify that you've completed a particular program of study that didn't result in a degree. Because if it resulted in a degree, it would be captured in the minimum education category. So that's what educational certificates are. They typically do not expire, kind of different than certifications or licenses. So this chart features occupations ordered by type of training and experience. So if you see here, the light blue on the top is credentials, the middle is on-the-job training, and the dark blue on the bottom is prior work experience. And you can see on the chart, all workers is in the middle, and 45% of all workers require credentials. At the top, you can see 100% of firefighters and lawyers are required to hold some sort of credential, which makes sense, right? And then down at the bottom, you can see HR specialists, that is 16.3% of them are required to hold a credential. So thinking about that, a lot of times when we talk to our survey respondents, they'll say, well, we prefer that they have this particular credential, but it's not required. If it's preferred but not required, we would not capture it as part of the ORS data. We only capture those required. And then the last piece of the puzzle for on-the-job training, or for SVP, is on-the-job training. And the way I like to describe this to people is it's the time that it takes to be up and running in a basic way once you've been hired on for the job. So we're talking here about the time it takes to learn basic tasks, the initial classes that jobs go to, shadowing, hands-on practice. It's got to be active learning time for us to capture it and on-the-job training. What we don't capture in it are things like continuing education, learning that's beyond the basic requirements. So we're talking here about, once you're up and running in a basic way, there are other things that you would still continue to learn. We don't want to capture that for on-the-job training. We also would not include corporate orientation because that's not vocationally relevant. We try to steer away from probationary periods because a lot of times the active learning is only a short portion of the probationary period. And then coaching for job development, some people call that mentoring. We don't capture that time either. So this next chart is going to show you examples of the average number of days of on-the-job training required. So, and then the percent of workers who must have that requirement. So you can see here that almost 70% of firefighters require on-the-job training after they've been hired, and the average number of days is 184. Right below that, you can see 68.9% of police and sheriff's officers require on-the-job training after hire, and the average there is 122 days. Contrast that with, down at the bottom, we have stalkers and order fillers. Almost all of them, almost 98% require on-the-job training, but their average days is only 11. So it varies, the requirements vary by the different type of occupation. So now we've talked about all four pieces. Remember, we take the time from all four of these categories and we add it together to come up with the overall SVP level for the job. And the SVP levels vary from, the lowest level is 1, which includes less than 4 hours of vocational preparation time, all the way up to SVP 9, which is more than 10 years. And on the next slide, we're going to look at a distribution of this. So if you look there over on the left, 2.7% of jobs require less than 4 hours of vocational training. So there are not that many that are in that category. Way more than that require from 4 hours up to a month. 32.7% of jobs require that much specific vocational preparation time. The other thing to note on this chart, and this is interesting, but if you look over to the right, you see 1 to 2 years and it says 6. That is the first place you're going to see jobs that require a bachelor's degree. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, a bachelor's degree takes 4 years. How can that be right? Well, for the purposes of ORS, 2 out of the 4 years of a bachelor's degree are considered to be general ed, so they're not considered part of specific vocational preparation. So if a job requires a bachelor's degree and nothing else, no on-the-job training, no credentials, then it would fall into that category 1 to 2 years, which is a 6. If it requires anything beyond that, it's going to be a 7 or an 8 or a 9, depending on how much additional time is required. All right, and then let's look at another set of SVP levels here. If you look up there at the top, it's a major occupational group, transportation and material moving occupations. And you might be looking at that data and saying, ooh, that's all over the place. People at 1, people at 8. The reason that this data is bimodal is because there are some low-level jobs in that group and there are some higher-level jobs in that group. So down at the bottom, we're going to have the people that move stuff around the warehouse, the people that drive forklifts, the people that just straight up drive trucks. And then over there to the right, we're going to see the supervisors of those people or the people that have higher technical skills in the warehouse. So that's why we have a bimodal distribution for that occupational group. If you look down at the bottom, that does not happen in a group like architecture and engineering occupations, because all of the people in those groups tend to be professionals, and the SVP required would be a degree or higher. All right, so that is it for SVP. And then our next group of elements, which I think you'll probably be pretty interested in because they're new, are the cognitive elements. Now, I will say we did publish some cognitive data in our first wave, but they've been completely revamped. And I think you'll find them to be more useful to you going forward. We have 5 basic kind of categories that I'd like to go through, and I'm going to talk about what each one of these cognitive elements means, just so you can better interpret the data. So the first group is work review, and we have 2 elements that we publish here: frequency of work being checked and presence of supervisor. So frequency of work being checked, what that means is the frequency of a lead worker or a supervisor checking the work. The highest frequency that we have for that one is more than once per day. And then we go to once per day and less often. And the checking there is to make sure performance standards are being met, has to be done by a supervisor or lead worker, and the employee needs to know that their work is being checked. The second one, presence of supervisor, is about, is there a supervisor physically present in the work area who would be able to immediately come to the assistance of a worker? So whether that's if they have a question or they're having a problem, is that supervisor working close enough nearby? And then we have some data to show you on that. So this is a chart with percentage of workers with work checked by supervisor more than once per day. And so that's our highest level of frequency. You can see almost all surgical technologists have this particular or check that often. The reason for that is, if you think about that job, they're in surgery with a surgeon who is checking their work as it goes along. So that's why that one is so high. That's why their work is checked very frequently. Or think about dental assistants. You know, you go in, you get your teeth cleaned. What happens after that? The dentist comes in and they look around in your mouth and they're like, oh, everything looks great. That's checking the dental assistant's work. Down there at the bottom, you see general office clerks. Their work is not checked that frequently. That could be because general office clerks do basic things that are repetitive, and so the supervisors don't have to check it that often because they're just doing the same things, and they're not that difficult. The tasks are not that difficult. So All right, so let's move on to the next group, which is personal contacts. There are two personal contacts elements that we publish. One is verbal interactions, and one is people skills. Verbal interactions means the frequency by which someone starts a new interaction with someone. So for example, if I'm a cashier, every new customer that I talk to would be a new verbal interaction. So when we talk to our respondents about the frequency of that, we want to ask things like, is the store ever so busy that they're back to back every few minutes dealing with a new customer? Or is it slower where they're really not seeing new customers that often? If there's people in meetings, people that deal with the same person for a long period of time are going to have less frequent verbal interactions. The next one is people skills, and people skills are the ability to listen, communicate, and relate to others. So we published two estimates for this: basic and more than basic for each job. Basic means the job works alone a lot, or they're only expected to engage in brief work-related interactions with people and treat others with respect. More than basic would be things beyond that. So interacting with people for longer periods of time, training new employees, contributing in meetings, things like that. That would be more than basic people skills. All right, the next category is work pace. And the first one there is control of workload. This one is interesting because what this one is really about is the work pushed to the worker by something or someone, or is the work self-paced? So if the work is pushed to the worker, there are 4 different ways that we kind of categorize that. So it could be pushed to the worker by machinery or equipment. It could be pushed to the worker by software. It could be pushed to the worker by some sort of daily or weekly performance target, you know, like a sales goal, something like that. Or it could be pushed to the worker by their supervisor. Those are contrasted to self-paced. So we publish estimates for all 5 of those different categories under control of workload. Pause control is pretty easy. What that one's about is it's about, can the worker step away from the work to take a mental break? If there's any critical task that they perform that would make it, which would not allow them to step away, then we would say they do not have pause control. But there are a lot of jobs that do. And then finally, work pace is a category that we collect. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you some data and explain it to you there. So you can see here on your screen on the left that we have the first category is consistent and generally slow. So what we're talking about here is jobs where they do something and then there's some sort of break, but it's consistent that way. So for example, a lab tech that performs an experiment and then they wait a little bit and then they have to do something else, or a job like a security guard where they allow someone entrance, you know, they screen someone into the building, but it's not a busy building, and then they wait for the next person to come and they perform the same thing. Consistently slow. The second category is consistent and generally fast. And when I hear the word fast, I always think rapid. And that's not necessarily the case with this one. There are some jobs that work consistently, rapidly. But we also include in this one workers that work steadily throughout the day. So if you're steadily busy in your job throughout the day, we would say that job is consistent and generally fast. And then varying is just what it might sound like. There are faster and slower periods, and there are marked faster and slower periods in the job. And that doesn't even have to be daily. It could be a seasonal variation in, you know, sometimes it's slow, but then during the busy season, it's fast. We would consider that job as varies as well. All right, we're almost finished, I promise. Problem solving is our next element, and what we're looking for here is how often a job is required to solve problems that take more than 5 minutes to think of a solution. So it's not a problem that takes more than 5 minutes to fix. It's a problem that takes independent thinking of 5 minutes or more to figure out what to do. And when I say independent thinking, if the person has to call someone else to help them solve the problem, that's not independent thinking. So when you're looking at the problem solving, that's what we're talking about there. And then the final category of cognitive and mental requirements is, we call it interactions. We have 3 of them: working with the general public, working around crowds, and telework. The first one, working with the general public, means exactly what it sounds like. If you deal with customers, you deal with vendors, anyone who's not your coworker would be working with the general public. What you see here on your screen right now is some data on working around crowds. I think this is interesting right now because I think most of us would agree we don't really want to be in a crowd these days. So in order for us to say a job works around crowds, it has to meet 5 criteria. And the 5 criteria are: 1, many unfamiliar people are present. 2, the movement of the workers restricted because there's a crowd. 3, any given arrangement of the crowd is temporary. 4 is it's disorganized, so they can't all be lined up. That's not a crowd. And then 5 is they're not separated from unfamiliar people by a counter or a divider or something like that. So if we have a concession worker working at a stadium, we would say they are not working in the crowd because they are behind the counter. And then the last interactions category that we have is telework. And when we talk about telework, we talk about the job has to perform their critical function from home. So the reason that we do this is, I'll give you an example. If we have home health aides, I think you can all agree that home health aides have to go to people's homes to provide health care. So some of them take paperwork home and do it at their house. Would we want to say that home health aides could telework as a whole? No, because they really can't. They really, in order to do their job, they have to go to people's homes. They just happen to perform some of their work at their house. So that's an example of where we would say, yeah, they can do some work at home, but we're not going to say that they can telework. All right, and then I'd like to talk about, now that we've looked at examples of all the estimates, where you can find them. Someone asked this earlier. So you can find them on our BLS website. They're all free. We have a couple of different ways they're presented, and I'm going to show you examples of them, but we have data, like a data query system. We have an Excel spreadsheet that includes every single estimate that you would ever want to see. We have occupational profiles for major groups, and then we have some smaller pieces that are highlights. So let's move on to the next and look at the database query tools that we have. So if you navigate to the ORS page, and the link on your screen would get you to this, would get you to a screen that included what you see here. There are 2 options. There's a single screen option for data retrieval, and there's a multi-screen option for data retrieval. So let's look first at the single screen one. So if you choose that green button, it's going to take you to a screen that looks like what you see on your right. And what you're going to do is you're going to select the occupation, the category, the requirement that you're looking for, and it's going to give you data, assuming that we have published data for whatever it is you're looking for. This is nice because you can pick all the things on one screen. There's another option, which is the multi-screen tool. And what this one's going to do is it's basically the same one as the previous, but it's going to allow you to choose, when you choose things, it's going to take you screen by screen. So the first screen will be the occupation, the second screen would be the element category, so on and so forth. And some people find it easier to pick multiple items from each of the sets of criteria from this view. But both of them will get you the exact same data once you've navigated your way through. We also, like I said earlier, we have complete Excel data sets. When I look at the ORS data, this is what I like to use. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because I'm a statistician, but I like it because I can sort, because I can, do pivot tables, because I can play with it a little bit more. So if you like to play with the data, this is a great thing. Go out there, grab that Excel data set and take a look. It includes all of the published estimates. We also have some fact sheets. These basically give you some information on a specific element or on a specific set of elements. So it's hard to read on your slide, I know, but this one that you see here is for sitting and standing. So it'll give you the definition of sitting and standing. It'll give you some additional information, and then it'll give you kind of a snippet of some of the data that we have available for sitting and standing. And the bullets that you see there at the bottom of your screen, gross and fine, minimum education, we have ORS fact sheets for all of those currently, plus a few more. And then we also have occupational profiles, which I like these too because these give you a highlight for a particular type of occupation of the main requirements that we're seeing in our data. So you see here on your screen, we have job requirements for architecture and engineering occupations, and then job requirements for healthcare practitioners and technical occupations. And it just gives you kind of a good overview of what we're seeing in the data for those types of jobs. And then our final thing we want to, oh, actually two more, sorry. We have the Economics Daily. We do these for different programs, not just for ORS, but what they are, they'll give you a chart or two charts and a little bit of text that just kind of highlights something that we think is interesting from the data. So the last two that we had for ORS were, let's see, what were they? Workers interacting with the public and food preparation and serving jobs. Those were at the bottom of that page. So, and then the last thing we have is, if you really want to take a deep dive into how ORS was developed, the procedures that we use to collect it, what the definitions are, that sort of thing, the Handbook of Methods is for you. So if you have a question on something like that, you can look here. It talks about the sample design. It talks about the calculations that we do. All of that is in here. If you read that and you're still not sure, we actually have people available to answer the phone to answer your questions, and I will give you that phone number at the end of this presentation. But the Handbook of Methods is where you want to go if you really want to take a deeper dive. So now that we've completely overwhelmed you with an unbelievable amount of information, we can go ahead and look at some of these questions. Mishi, have you had a chance to look at any of them? Or?
I have not yet. Let's have a look.
Okay, let's see. So the first one says, I've seen documents on job analyses whereby seldom on the job analysis is less than 10% and others that is 5% or less. Why 2%? Okay, so I can answer this. So originally when we started collecting this data, you know that we're doing it, SSA is, we're doing it for them. We are their contractor. And when we originally started, we didn't have any category that was that small. We just had up to 1/3 of the day. And it was through, I guess, discussions with SSA that 2% was decided that would be the threshold for the seldom category. So that's why that was determined. All right, then let's see. Mishi, the next one is why use median weight, for example, rather than, why use mean rather than median? Doesn't it mean the possibility of skewing the value?
I
So
was
you want
just
to
going
take
to
that
say
one?
that. I can go ahead and answer that. So we try to provide you both measures. So we have a mean because some people like to know the average. That can be important to people looking at occupational data from a certain light. But then we also provide the median with the percentiles. So for many estimates, you can actually see both. And if there is the skew that you referenced, you can use the median instead.
All right, the next one I can take, so slide 26 indicates no sedentary production numbers. Did I get that right? I would have to look, I don't have the data set up. I don't know that there are no production workers that are considered sedentary work, but it may be that we haven't published any production workers that have sedentary work.
It might be a very small percentage too, that we were either not able to publish or that might not be included on this chart.
Yeah.
So we can check into that and get back to you if you would like.
Okay, and I can take the one, have environmental conditions been updated based on COVID? For example, many more restaurant workers are serving outside or retail workers curbside. That's a very good question. So what we are doing in terms of going forward collecting the requirements is when we talk to our survey respondents, if they consider the change to be a permanent change to the way the work is being done, then that would be reflected in our estimates. If they say it's a temporary change that they don't intend to keep long term, then we would say, okay, how was it done prior to COVID? So that is how we're handling that at this point. Let's see. The next one, so ORS data, ORS stands for Occupational Requirements Statistics. That's the name of the survey itself. So that's when we talk about ORS, we're talking about all this giant pile of data that we have on occupational requirements.
So there's one about strength level as well, I see, Karen. And when
Okay.
strength level required for jobs is presented, this is weighted by the number of jobs. Is this weighted by the number of jobs within each occupation or the number of occupations? So the strength level presented was for all civilian workers. So that would be all of the different occupations. And then we also published them broken out by occupation.
All right, here's one. On literacy, I was not clear. You said a certain percentage did not have literacy versus what level of literacy was required. This conflicts with the prior statement that literacy does not mean what formal education is required. So are you saying that collected data that certain numbers of dishwashers did not have literacy required? Okay, so I probably did misspeak. Here's what we've got. So if we, from a data collection standpoint, if I go into a company and I say, what's the minimum education required for your dishwashers? And they say, none. And I say, not even high school. And they say, nope, we hire high school employees to wash dishes. They don't have to have high school. Then we have a second question that we ask is, do they need to be able to read and write? And that's what we're able to publish. So if no formal education is required, not even high school, then we publish, do they have to be able to read and write or not? And that's what's reflected in those literacy estimates. I hope that answered the question. Let's see. Is there data regarding cognitive functioning related to attention, concentration, memory, or other related cognitive functions typically compromised in a head injury? Nothing specific to that. I think you could get to it a little bit, maybe with the problem solving, but I don't think that would be directly, a direct correlation with that. But I think that would probably be the closest data that we have to something like that.
So the next one is sit or stand, and asking about what we do if the worker cannot do job functions sitting or standing. And that's a good question. So standing includes walking, and sitting includes lying down. And that's how we break up sit and stand in the ORs. Karen, do you have anything to add to that might go more into depth?
So if a job has a choice, I know it's become very popular that people have standing desks these days. If you can choose to stand all day and you do, we're going to say you can sit all day, just because, it's your choice. If a worker is choosing to stand versus sitting, we're not going to say that's a requirement of the job. So, and this also, let's say it's a cashier at a grocery store, and we go in there and they say, well, if someone had to sit down, if we needed to accommodate them, we could get a stool for somebody potentially. We don't include accommodations either. So making a special accommodation for somebody because they can't stand would not be included in the data. What we're going to do is we're going to report what's required in terms of sitting or standing. And to add to Mishi's, standing includes walking. It also includes any of the other physical elements that are not sitting. So climbing ladders, climbing ropes or scaffolds. Low posture work is also included in the standing walking estimate.
Are the occupations the same as the OES groups is the next question. And yes, when we publish at the 6-digit SOC level, they're classified by the same occupational classification system as OES. And then I see the next is environment, and asking if cold temperature is not considered when the person works outside. And that would not be considered because the ORS doesn't take into account weather. So that's how I would best describe environmental. And outdoor captures outdoor, indoor, and then hot and cold captures indoor, and ORS does not capture weather at all.
Well,
except for outdoor.
So weather is captured in outdoors, and that's the only place it's captured is in outdoors. If you see an estimate for extreme heat or extreme cold, that is indoor extreme heat or indoor extreme cold. So
if it helps you visualize better, you can envision for extreme heat like a chef cooking over a hot pan in a really hot kitchen. that would be heat indoor, or somebody working in a meat locker would be out, or would be extreme cold. So that's an indoor cold. But then I always use an example as well of a dog walker in Alaska versus a dog walker in Florida, and they would both be exposed to the outdoors. We wouldn't capture the weather.
So there's one about, will excluded occupations be added in the future, for example, agriculture? I know we're thinking about things like that. They're thinking about the federal government being captured in our estimates too. It's just when or where that would happen is above my pay grade. Let's see. How will SSA use this data when they rely currently on the DOT, which provides the exertional and non-exertional requirements of a job by individual DOT occupation and not SOC group? There can be many DOT occupations within each SOC group with different SVPs. Will SSA be changing their regulations? So we can't really speak for SSA, but I do know that they are, they're going to use our data along with data from some other sources to create something with that they're calling the OIS, the Occupational Information System. And they will use that in conjunction with their policy, which they may or may not modify in order to be able to use that data. So that's more of a question for SSA than for BLS. And I hate to dodge it, but that's, you'd have to ask them. So sorry.
Do we have a written guide on environmental conditions that should be considered? We have some resources on our website. We have some materials that show pictures of environmental conditions. You can find that on the, let me look really quickly on the ORS website and I can tell you which drop down. That'll be on the About ORS tab under Info for Survey Participants. So you'll be able to see the visual guides there for environmental conditions.
Yep. Or if you still have questions, you can always call us and we're going to give you that phone number at the end. So let's see. So next question, why was federal ag, self-employed, and business owners excluded? Did I get that correct? You did get that correct. So the ORS was originally started on a survey platform from the National Compensation Survey, and those things were excluded from that particular survey. So that's why they were not included in the original ORS design. The other thing I would say about the owners, owners of companies do all kinds of different things that vary very widely. So I don't know how useful information on owners would be. But again, it's something we're considering collecting. We are considering the ag workers. We're considering the federal government workers too. So stay tuned. Someday you may see those included in our estimates too.
The next question I see about the DOT and whether the ORS has retired the DOT. And the DOT is not a BLS product and the ORS is. So they might be used by an outside user interchangeably, but we only control the ORS and the BLS side and what we do with the ORS and how we estimate it and collect it.
Well, and I will say this, the DOT is a Department of Labor publication, and we stopped updating the DOT in 1991. So it's, and that was not BLS, that was Department of Labor. So that has not been touched since 1991, and there's no plan to do that anymore. It was replaced by ONET. So the DOT will not be updated.
The next question I see is, what is the definition of light work? And I wanted to point out briefly with that question that we do have a fact sheet called sedentary strength level, and it shows you a table on table 1 where we have the different weights and durations that we use to calculate strength levels in work. And we have it for all of the levels. We have it for light, medium, heavy, and very heavy, as well as some information about light work. And we'll actually be adding a fact sheet about light strength level and light work upcoming. So probably within the next month, we'll have a fact sheet posted on that topic. Karen, do you have anything to add?
I know light work, I know that they combine the amount of weight lifted and carried along with the amount of time a job spends standing, walking to determine the strength level of the job. So that you'll see that in the fact sheet, I think. And if that's not there, you could also look in the handbook of methods would give you the actual formula that they use to determine the strength level of jobs. All right, Misha, you want to take the next one about searching?
The SSA one?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, since the whole purpose of SSA asking BLS to create the ORs is for adjudication of disability claims, how can you tell us from a practical standpoint how to use the search screens to find occupational groups that allow for multiple limitations and extrapolate that to numbers of such occupations in the national economy? So that actually is a couple of different questions together. I'm not sure if this is answering them in order, but we do have on the tech note of the news release how many workers are represented by the ORs in the national economy, and we break it down by occupation. So with the weighting, we tell you how many workers the ORs is weighted to represent. I also use the Excel spreadsheet primarily, and I can't speak to occupational groups that allow for multiple limitations, but I often use the physical, environmental, cognitive, and education and training together. So a worker might be physically able to do a job, but not meet the educational requirements of that job. So it might still not be an appropriate job for them. And using the different categories of the ORs together for an occupation, you can see a better idea of that occupation. And I actually think that the occupational profiles that Karen referenced at the end of her part of the presentation do that fairly well.
And if you're searching for something specific and you're not finding us, give us a call. We'll see if we can help you. Sometimes it's going to be a limitation of the data. You know, we're in year one of a 5-year wave. We're not going to be able to publish every particular element for every specific job, but wherever we can help you out, we're happy to do that. All right, so someone said, but some jobs at a bench have a stool available. If a stool is available and they can sit on it, you're right. Like a lot of bank tellers now have stools available to them. If they can sit on a stool, if that's standard, then we would say that job could sit all day.
And the next question is the ORs is based on occupational group or SOC rather than job, like the dot. And so the ORs has occupational groups and detailed occupations. So it is, as Karen says, the dot hasn't been updated in a long time, and the ORs is a separate product. So we don't tend to compare it to the dot or the DOT. Do you have anything else to add there, Karen?
Yeah, nothing from the DOT is represented in the ORS data. Everything is SOC based. So let's see, aside from SVP, does the ORS define any other skills that can be used in a transferable skills analysis? I'm just going to be honest and say I've not seen a transferable skills analysis, but in terms of job skills, the SVP is what we've got. So hopefully it's helpful to you, but that's what we've got. With sit-stand desks, did you ask or know how many businesses are using this? No, sorry. Send it in as a suggested data item that we could collect. Let's see.
The next question is, since sitting includes lying down, do you break out the amount of occupations that can be performed lying down? And the short answer is we don't. Lying down is combined with sit-stand, and we don't break it out specifically.
All right, the next one, where's the length of the workday being captured or reported at the occupation level? We don't actually publish length of workdays, like average length of workdays or anything like that. I know Mishi had said in hers, what we do is we collect durations of time that elements are being performed based on any workday. So it doesn't matter if it's an 8-hour day or a 12-hour day or a 4-hour day. If the estimate says that, you know, they reach overhead up to 2% of the day, it would be up to 2% of any of those different types of work.
Is it expected that the main users of this data will be concerned with SSA disability determination, and what other users are expected to rely heavily on it? And that's a really good question. My first answer is in the Handbook of Methods, we have a section that describes potential data users. So while the SSA is our primary stakeholder, as I said before, the ORS has many different groups that use ORS data to do various things with it. So we do have a list, and it is in the Handbook of Methods, but it is also not exhaustive of all ORS data users. So please keep that in mind when you're using it.
All right, I'll take the next one. The second wave redefinition of weight lifted and carried for light work moved to 10 to 25 pounds. Did SSA ask for this change in the definition of light work? So that change was made to make it more consistent across the different levels. So if you'll notice now, even for the frequently and constantly, it used to be they were slightly off, and I'm trying to remember exactly what they were, and I used to teach it, which that's part of the problem. We couldn't remember what the differences were. So now it's less than a pound, 1 pound up to 10 pounds, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 55 to 70, and 75 to 100. And that's just for ease of data collection. It made sense to SSA. They did a bunch of analysis on whether making that change was going to significantly impact the estimates, and apparently it didn't. So that's why that decision was made, and that decision was approved by SSA. Does literacy mean literacy in English? You know what? I'm going to have to get back to you on that because I'm not sure. I think it does, but I don't want to say 100%. I don't want to tell you the wrong answer. So we can get back to you on that one.
So the next question I see is, at the end of 2023, will OR's final second wave data be reported by NAICS at the SOC level? And the answer right now is no. The ORS is classified by occupation and not by NAICS in the published estimates.
The next one, what are the backgrounds of the folks conducting the survey contacts? The people that collect this data are professional economists. Everyone that collects this data is required to have at least a bachelor's degree in statistics or economics. They're highly trained. We collect, prior to COVID, we collected a large percentage of this data in person. We would go out and do personal interviews with companies. Now we're kind of having to pivot. We're just starting to do it by Microsoft Teams. But the data is collected by professional statisticians and economists.
So do you ever get people expressing concerns that their experiences and findings are not consistent with yours? And how do you recommend they address it, particularly in litigated settings? For example, in my experience, security jobs are not generally sedentary, but walking and standing. So we're really transparent about our estimates and where they come from, how they're collected, and what our methodology is. Sometimes we define certain estimates in very specific ways. So if you have a question on how we define an estimate or more about how the ORS collects, you can find the information on our website, or you can contact us. Do you have any further comments on that question, Karen?
Nope, I think you handled that well. So somebody asked, we are available by phone. I'm going to give the phone number, Mishi. You can write it down, and then it's also in the presentation that Stephanie put out on your wherever the conference stuff is. But the phone number, if you have a pen, 202-691-6199. So, and you know what? You could actually end up talking to Mishi if you call that number, because sometimes she answers that line. So give us a call.
I do. As a quick heads up right now, since because of remote work, we might get back to you if you leave a voicemail. So feel free to leave your contact information in the form of a voicemail with your name and number, or you can email us at orsinfo@bls.gov. And that's the same way to reach economist staff who can answer all of your questions about the ORS.
How do you suggest to explain the distinction between walk and stand when the survey has them lumped together? I do not know. They're lumped together. Standing walking is something that's always been combined for as long as we've been doing ORS, and I think that's the way SSA has always had it, but I could be wrong. I'm newer than this to you, so unfortunately I don't know that there's any way to break out what part of the stand walk estimate is standing versus walking. So Let's see. You got the next one?
Sure. So many work from home jobs are not being captured in the DOT or even the ONET. For instance, a telehealth practitioner or nurse. And will these types of occupations be captured in the ORS? And so the ORS captures in the cognitive requirements whether or not workers in an occupation have the capability of teleworking. So, and we use the SOC to define that. So you should be able to find some of the estimates you need on telework in the ORS.
Will the 5-year data set cover all SOC occupations? We're going to try as hard as we can to cover all, and that's the reason for that new sample design that we talked about. So we're going to get as many as we possibly can.
As many estimates as we can, and we have our publication standards in the handbook of methods as well. So we're sampling in a way to maximize the number of occupations and the requirements within those occupations in our final wave final estimates, or sorry, second wave final estimates.
Let's see. It appears you've greatly broadened the definition of OJT we've used over 50 years in our profession and is much more generic, time to learn basic tasks. In the past, OJT was a structured program of some sort. Why was that done? I don't know that we've broadened it as much as, I mean, it's defined as active learning, required to have someone up and running in a basic way in the job. So that would include classes, it would include shadowing, demonstrating things to a new worker, that sort of thing. So there is a pretty distinct definition for it. And we, our field economists are trained to know what to include and what to exclude. So it's not, I don't know if that helps you, but we do have specific criteria for the amount of time that we say a job is being trained on the job.
The final couple questions, it looks like, need us to repeat the phone number for the ORS. So the phone number is 202-691-6199. And there's a staff of economists who will answer the phone from 8:30 to 4 each day. Right now, you may have to leave a voicemail and we will get back to you when we can. Within the 24 hours, usually.
All right, and that concludes our time. Thank you, ladies, so much for everything and answering all those questions. I'm now going to share with you all your 3-digit code. It is the letter K, number 8, letter I. Again, that's letter K, number 8, letter I. And we will see you all here in about 10 minutes for your next breakout sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, ladies.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey.